I can still feel the tools. That's what nobody tells you about surviving a Haemonculus laboratory. They don't prepare you during officer training at the Schola Progenium for the sensation that never leaves. The phantom touch of instruments that should not exist pressed against nerves that remember being exposed to air that tasted like copper and ozone, and something sweet that made your throat close. 23 months since the Dark Eldar raid on Firebase Mordian. 17 months since the Space Marine Strike Force breached the Flesh Lab deep in the outer reaches of Komorog's subrealms. And I still wake up feeling the delicate pressure of flensing hooks tracing patterns across muscles that are whole and intact under my skin. The mind remembers what the body has forgotten, or perhaps more accurately, the body remembers what the mind desperately tries to forget. My name is Captain Davros Kellen, formerly of the Mordian 58th Infantry Regiment, currently assigned to administrative duties on Terra itself, because the Departamento Munitorum determined that an officer who screams during tactical briefings whenever someone uses certain medical terminology is unsuitable for frontline command. They are not wrong. I spent 4 standard Terran days in the laboratory of a creature calling itself Cythrian, the anatomist, and those 4 days taught me more about the malleability of flesh, the elasticity of sanity, and the true meaning of the word forever than 37 years of Imperial service ever could. What I witnessed in that place of polished metal and living sculpture, what I experienced as both observer and canvas, has rewritten my understanding of suffering itself. The Imperium trains its officers to resist interrogation. We practice techniques for withstanding pain, methods for compartmentalizing trauma, protocols for maintaining operational security under duress. I scored exceptionally high in resistance training at the Schola. I once endured 6 hours of electro-interrogation without divulging classified information, earning a commendation from my instructors. That training was designed by minds that understood pain as a tool of coercion, suffering as a means to an end. The Dark Eldar do not use pain as a tool. They use it as a language, as art, as a fundamental currency of their existence. And a Haemonculus is not an interrogator. He is a maestro, conducting a symphony written in screaming nerves and reconstructed flesh, and you are simultaneously instrument, audience, and composition. The raid came during the 3rd watch on a Tuesday. I remember that detail with crystalline clarity because I had been reviewing patrol schedules when the first Vox Caster screams cut through the command bunker's filtered air. Firebase Mordian occupied a strategic position on Hesperus 7, a mining world whose primary export was adamantium ore, and whose secondary export was frozen corpses from the perpetual winter that gripped its surface. We maintained a garrison of 8,000 souls spread across defensive positions designed to repel orc incursions or chaos cult uprisings. The fortifications were solid, the men well-trained, the void shields calibrated to Imperial standard specifications. None of it mattered. The Dark Eldar came through webway portals that opened like wounds in reality itself. Tears in the fabric of space that bled violet light and discharged sleek figures moving with a speed that made our targeting cogitators lag behind actual positions. I remember standing in the command center watching tactical displays that showed impossible movement vectors, raiders that appeared in 3 locations simultaneously before the Auspex could resolve their true positions. The attack lasted 17 minutes. In that time, they killed perhaps 300 of my men and took 2,000 more. The efficiency was surgical. They weren't trying to capture the firebase. They were harvesting it. I was in the secondary command bunker when the wall exploded inward. Not from explosives. From something that simply made the reinforced rockcrete cease existing in a circular pattern 3 meters wide, the edges of the hole smooth and glassy, as though the material had been convinced to politely remove itself from reality. Through that opening came figures that moved like liquid darkness poured into vaguely humanoid shapes, wearing armor that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. I reached for my last pistol. My hand touched the grip. Then something struck the back of my neck, and the world became a falling sensation that lasted forever. Consciousness returned in stages, each one worse than unconsciousness. First came sound, A wet clicking rhythm like meat being sectioned, accompanied by a harmonic drone that my mind initially interpreted as machinery before recognizing it as screaming so constant it had become ambient noise. Then came smell, the copper-iron reek of fresh blood mixed with chemical preservatives. Underneath it all, a sweet corruption that reminded me of flowers rotting in summer heat. Touch came next, and with it the realization that I was suspended vertically, my wrists and ankles held by restraints that felt warm and slightly yielding, almost organic. Taste followed, metallic and bitter, my mouth dry as parchment. Finally, reluctantly, came sight. The laboratory was vast. That was my first coherent thought upon opening my eyes. The ceiling arched overhead at least 20 meters up, composed of some dark material that seemed to shift and flow at the edges of perception. Covered in what might have been veins or circuitry pulsing with sickly bioluminescence. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing shapes that had once been human or xenos or something in between, preserved in various states of transformation or dissection. Some were still moving. The floor was obsidian smooth and covered in channels etched in complex geometric patterns, currently running with fluids ranging in color from arterial crimson to chemical green, to something that looked like liquid mercury but moved with obvious sentience. The center of the space was dominated by workstations, not surgical theaters in any recognizable sense, but rather stages or altars where flesh was being actively reworked into forms that defied taxonomy. I counted at least 30 subjects in various states of operation, suspended or strapped to surfaces that adjusted their contours to accommodate the modifications being performed. Around each station moved figures in what I initially mistook for medical garments, before realizing the robes and aprons were grafted directly to their wearers' bodies, the fabric and flesh forming a seamless integration. These were racks, I would learn later. The Haemonculus' assistants, themselves products of the same dark art they now practiced upon others. And moving between the stations with the unhurried grace of an artist touring his own gallery was Zithrian. He stood perhaps 2.5 meters tall, though his actual height was difficult to determine because his spine curved and straightened as he moved, vertebrae visible through translucent skin that revealed the machinery of his body beneath. His limbs were too long, jointed in too many places, ending in hands that possessed 12 fingers each, every digit tipped with a different implement, scalpels, needles, hooks, sensors, things I had no names for. His face was stretched like a mask pulled taut, features arranged in an approximation of Eldar beauty that was worse than any Monkey's natural ugliness, because it was beauty deliberately ruined, made terrible through surgical precision. His eyes were vertical pupils, dilated wide in the dim bioluminescence, and they contained an intelligence vast and terrible, and utterly without mercy or malice. He did not hate me. He did not feel anything for me at all except professional curiosity. "Awake," he said, and his voice was beautiful. That was perhaps the most horrible thing. It was a cultured tenor with perfect Gothic pronunciation, warm and almost gentle, the voice of a scholar or a priest discussing matters of theology. Excellent. The paralytic has worn to optimal levels, full sensation, minimal motor function. You can feel, you can see, you can hear, you can process, but you cannot escape. The ideal canvas. If you're watching this and already feeling the weight of what comes next, leave the word "witnessed" in the comments. Let it be known that someone, somewhere acknowledges what happened to the thousands who never returned from the Dark City's laboratories. He approached my restraints with a device in one hand that resembled a crystalline syringe, filled with something that glowed with its own internal light. "You are wondering where you are," he continued conversationally, as though we were colleagues discussing a mutual project. "You are wondering what I intend to do with you. You are wondering if you will die. These are predictable questions. Let me provide predictable answers. You are in my personal workshop in the Venom Gardens sector of Komarag. I intend to explore the structural possibilities of your flesh. And no, you will not die. Death is release. Death is failure of technique. My subjects remain alive through processes that would make your Imperium's most advanced Medicae weep with envy and incomprehension. The crystalline syringe touched my neck. I felt pressure, then a cold, spreading sensation that raced through my circulatory system like ice water displacing blood. The pain came after, a burning that started in my chest and radiated outward through every extremity, every organ, every nerve cluster. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When it stopped, my body felt hypersensitive, every breath of recycled air across my skin registering as distinct sensation, every fiber of the restraints noticeable as individual pressure points. Alchemical nerve enhancement, Cythrian explained, his tone that of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. Your nervous system now operates at approximately 300% baseline sensitivity. This allows for much more refined work. The suffering is not the goal, you understand. It is merely a byproduct of optimal sensation, which is necessary for the art to have meaning. Pain without perception is wasted. Perception without enhancement is crude. You will experience everything I do to you with perfect clarity. He moved to a nearby table covered in instruments. They were arranged with meticulous care, each tool positioned precisely, creating patterns that were almost mandala-like in their geometric perfection. He selected something that looked like a tuning fork made of bone, its tines ending in hooks so fine they were barely visible. "We will begin with something simple," he said. "A diagnostic study. I wish to understand how your Moncane musculature responds to selective fiber separation. This will hurt, but it will not harm. An important distinction." The tool touched my left forearm. I felt each individual hook penetrate the skin, sinking through the dermis with a sensation like being caressed by frozen needles. He began to hum, a melodic sound that made the tool vibrate. The hooks moved deeper, following muscle fibers with surgical precision, separating individual strands of tissue without severing them, simply dividing the structure into component threads. The pain was electric, sharp, and specific, each fiber's separation registering as a distinct note in an ascending scale of agony. Through it all, I could feel the muscle remaining functional, the tendons still attached, the structure fundamentally intact, even as it was being systematically disassembled. "Fascinating," Cythrian murmured, leaning close to examine his work. "Your species maintains surprising cohesion. The individual fibers are crude, thick, inefficient compared to Eldar physiology, but the sheer redundancy provides remarkable resilience. I can separate nearly 40% of the muscle mass, and you retain 70% functionality. Wasteful from a design perspective, but pragmatically effective." He withdrew the tool. The hooks came out clean, pulling no tissue with them, leaving my arm looking completely unmarked from the outside, despite the fact that I could feel the internal structure had been fundamentally rearranged. "We will allow that to set," he said, returning to his instrument table. "The fibers will fuse back together in approximately 6 hours, slightly stronger than before due to trauma bonding. Unless, of course, we prevent that fusion, but we will make that decision later." This was how the first day proceeded. He worked on me for what I estimated was 8 hours, though time became increasingly difficult to track in the unchanging artificial environment of the laboratory. Each procedure was explained with scholarly precision, the removal of a section of abdominal muscle to study its layer composition, the temporary relocation of my liver, 6 centimeters to the left, to examine how the surrounding organs adjusted to the displacement, the insertion of a filament through my optic nerve that allowed him to literally see through my eyes, watching his own face reflected in my vision as he studied my reactions. Each process was performed with exquisite care to avoid permanent damage, to keep me alive and aware and functional. Between procedures, he would discuss his work, not with me, but rather at me, using me as an audience for his artistic philosophy. "The Moncane body is a puzzle," he explained while reattaching my relocated liver with sutures that dissolved into my flesh as they were tied. "Your Imperium sees it as a machine, something to be maintained and repaired and eventually replaced. They miss the fundamental truth. Flesh is not mechanical. It is plastic, malleable. Reality is merely the default state, not the only possible state. Everybody is a potential sculpture waiting to be revealed through proper technique. Around us, the other subjects provided a constant backdrop of suffering. A human man suspended in an alcove to my right was being systematically transformed into something with too many joints, his screams modulating in pitch as vocal cords were restructured. An Eldar woman, not Dark Eldar but Craftworld. Her armor displayed in an alcove like a trophy, hung in a crystalline cage filled with fluid, her body covered in flowering growths that bloomed and withered in repeating cycles, each death triggering visible spasms of pain across her features. An orc, impossibly still alive despite being reduced to a head and partial torso, was mounted on a wall and connected to tubes that pumped fluorescent liquids through what remained of his circulatory system, his eyes rolling in continuous panic. "My gallery," Cythrian said, following my gaze. "Each piece represents months or years of work. The Eldar is particularly challenging. Her species' physiology allows for exquisite modifications that would kill lesser beings. She has been flowering for 17 standard Terran months now. Each bloom extracts a measured amount of pain, which I harvest and refine. She will continue for at least another 3 years before the process exhausts her regenerative capacity. Longevity is important in art. Ephemeral suffering is crude." He returned his attention to me, selecting a new implement from his table. This one resembled a paintbrush with bristles made of something that gleamed like metal but moved with organic fluidity. "Now we attempt something more creative," he said. "Your skin is crude canvas, thick and insensitive. I will enhance it. This will allow for more refined work later." The brush touched my chest, and I understood immediately why the Eldar woman had been screaming earlier. Each bristle was a filament that penetrated the skin and rooted itself in the nerve clusters beneath, forming a network that essentially turned my entire chest into a single exposed nerve. The sensation was beyond pain, beyond any category my mind had words for. It was perception so intense it transcended suffering and became something closer to sensory overload. Every molecule of air that touched the treated area, registering as distinct sensation, the microscopic movements of my own breathing feeling like tectonic shifts of flesh. "Beautiful," Cythrian breathed. "Look at the pattern it creates. The bristles arrange themselves according to your nervous system's natural architecture. Every subject creates a unique configuration. Yours suggests someone who has experienced significant trauma already. See these clusters near your primary nerve trunks? Those are scarring patterns, probably from electrical burns. You have been tortured before, yes?" I managed a noise that might have been an affirmative. Speech was beyond me. My entire consciousness had narrowed to the sensation of existing inside a body that felt like it was being caressed by every molecule in the surrounding atmosphere. "Good," he said. "Previous trauma creates interesting complications in the flesh memory. Your body carries maps of old pain, and those maps influence how new suffering propagates through your nervous system. I can use that. I can create harmonics between old scars and new modifications. Your pain will resonate with itself, creating interference patterns of sensation. Quite advanced work. Are you beginning to understand the true horror? If this level of calculated cruelty makes you grasp why the Dark Eldar are beyond redemption, show it. Subscribe so more people can learn what lurks in Komori's depths." The second day began with Cythrian discussing his plans as though I were a collaborator rather than a subject. "Today we explore structural modification," he announced, approaching with a device that looked like a cage made of living wire. "Your skeletal system is admirably sturdy but aesthetically limited. We will address that limitation." The wire cage was pressed against my right hand. I felt the individual strands sink through the flesh without resistance, wrapping around the metacarpal bones with a sensation like roots growing through soil. Then they began to pull. Not quickly, not violently. With slow, measured pressure, the cage drew my finger bones apart, creating gaps between them that filled immediately with some kind of regenerative foam that hardened into new bone, even as it formed. My hand expanded. I watched, unable to look away, as my fingers lengthened by perhaps 3 centimeters each, the new bone segments articulating perfectly with the original structure. The Mon K skeleton is so inflexible, Cytherean explained, adjusting the cage's tension with minute precision. Your bones grow once and then stop, locked into their adult proportions. Eldar physiology maintains a degree of plasticity throughout life. I can give you that gift temporarily. These new bone segments will feel completely natural within hours, indistinguishable from your original structure until I choose to remove them. He was right. The pain of the lengthening faded as the regenerative foam completed its work, leaving me with a hand that looked wrong, fingers too long and thin, but felt functionally normal. I could flex each digit, could feel the new joints articulating smoothly. The wrongness was not in the sensation, but in the knowledge of what had been done, the understanding that my own body had been made alien to me through craft and chemical alchemy. Cytherean spent the next several hours performing similar modifications across my body. My spine received 3 additional vertebrae, increasing my height by perhaps 8 centimeters and giving my posture an elongated quality that felt deeply unnatural despite being structurally sound. My ribs were separated slightly, expanding my chest cavity and allowing my lungs greater expansion range while creating a gaunt, starved appearance. My jaw was extended forward subtly, just enough to alter the proportion of my face without making the change immediately obvious to casual observation. Each modification was explained, demonstrated, and executed with the same scholarly precision. "Do you begin to see the potential?" he asked, stepping back to examine his work. "You are still fundamentally yourself. Your genetic code remains unaltered. Your organic systems function normally. But you are also something more than you were. Every change opens new possibilities for future modifications. You are becoming a gradient rather than a fixed state." Around us, the racks continued their endless work on other subjects. I watched as one of them, a creature whose body had been fused with its surgical implements until it was unclear where flesh ended and tools began, performed a procedure on a dark Eldar youth that involved systematically removing the subject's skin in a single unbroken sheet while keeping the dermis alive and connected via microscopic blood vessels. The youth, because he was dark Eldar and therefore understood pain as currency, seemed to be experiencing something closer to ecstasy than suffering, his eyes rolled back and his mouth forming words in the flowing language of Comorag. "That one is being elevated," Cytherean explained, noticing my attention. "He has pleased his Archon and been gifted to me for enhancement. In 3 months, he will return to his cabal with reflexes sharpened to supernatural levels, and pain tolerance that will make him nearly unstoppable in close combat. The process requires complete nerve system restructuring, which necessitates the skin removal. Pain is the tutor that teaches the body new possibilities." He turned back to me, selecting another instrument. This one I recognized from Medici training, a surgical laser, though one far more sophisticated than anything the Imperium produced. "Now we address aesthetics," he said. "Your face carries the typical Mon-Ki characteristics. Crude features, thick bone structure, minimal definition. I will correct that." The laser activated with a sound like singing crystal. He brought it to my cheekbone and began to cut, not through the bone, but rather reshaping it, vaporizing microscopic layers in a pattern that gradually altered the structure's contour. The smell of my own burning bone filled my nostrils, strangely organic and almost pleasant, like exotic incense. There was pain, yes, but the nerve enhancement from the previous day meant I could feel every individual cell being destroyed with perfect clarity, each death registering as a distinct pinpoint of sensation that aggregated into a constellation of controlled suffering. The Mon-K face is limited by your evolutionary history, Cythrian lectured as he worked, moving from my cheekbones to my brow ridge with methodical precision. Your ancestors needed thick bones to protect against blunt trauma, heavy jaws for crushing coarse food, minimal fine motor control in facial muscles because your species communicates primarily through crude verbal language rather than subtle expression. All of these practical considerations create faces that are aesthetically functional. I prefer to think beyond function. The restructuring took hours. When he finally stepped back and activated a reflective field that allowed me to see myself, I understood what he meant. My face was still recognizably human, still clearly my own features, but refined somehow, the proportions adjusted to achieve a harmony that natural growth never would have created. My cheekbones sat higher and more defined, my brow sat lower and more prominent, my jawline traced a sharper angle. I looked like a statue of myself, idealized and perfected and utterly wrong. Now you begin to approach Eldar aesthetics, Cythrian said, with something that might have been satisfaction in his tone. Still Mon-Ki, but touched by superior understanding of what flesh can achieve when properly directed. I could go further. I could make you beautiful by Kamoraj standards, but that would require breaking you first, and I am not finished with your instruction. He returned me to passive suspension for what I estimated was 12 hours, allowing my modified body to settle into its new configurations. During that time, I hung in my restraints and watched him work on other subjects. A human woman was being transformed into something serpentine. Her spine extended and multiplied until her body trailed behind her torso, like a tail covered in articulated segments. An orc was being systematically implanted with crystalline growths that his regenerative physiology immediately tried to enclose in scar tissue, creating a continuous cycle of growth and containment that covered his body in glittering armor made of his own rejection response. A Tau, his remaining technology displayed nearby like archaeological artifacts, was being studied for his neural architecture, his exposed brain covered in monitoring filaments as Cythrian's racks mapped the alien's cognitive structures. The third day brought vivisection. That word does not convey the reality of the experience. The human language has insufficient terminology for what a Haemonculus can achieve when granted access to a living subject and unlimited time. Vivisection suggests crude butchery, rapid dissection, academic study. What Cythrian performed was closer to live deconstruction, a systematic revelation of every layer of my internal architecture, while keeping each system functional and aware. He began with my abdominal cavity. The incision was made with something that separated flesh without cutting, simply convincing the tissue to divide itself along predetermined lines. My skin peeled back like opening a book, revealing the muscle wall beneath. That, too, separated, exposing the peritoneum and the glistening organs it contained. Throughout the process, I remained conscious and sensation-capable, feeling every layer's separation as a discrete event, my mind cataloging each progressive revelation of my own interior geography. Your visceral arrangement is standard for your species, Cythrian observed, using delicate forceps to lift my stomach slightly, examining it from multiple angles. Redundant, inefficient, but remarkably resilient. The human digestive tract is a marvel of wasted potential. You use perhaps 30% of the nutrients available in your food, voiding the rest as waste. Eldar physiology extracts 97% efficiency. I could improve you. Would you like that? To be enhanced? I had no voice to answer, but he seemed to take my silence as agreement. He selected a vial of something iridescent and used a micro-injector to introduce it directly into my stomach lining. Catalytic bacteria, he explained. They will colonize your digestive tract and begin breaking down food at the molecular level, extracting nutrients your body normally cannot process. The adjustment period will be agonizing as they establish themselves. The bacteria must convince your body not to reject them. They do this by mimicking pain signals until your immune system recognizes them as native flora. It takes approximately 6 weeks. You will feel like you are dying of food poisoning for the entire duration. He moved systematically through my organs, each one receiving similar examination and modification. My liver was restructured to process toxins more efficiently, though the restructuring required breaking down its existing cellular architecture and rebuilding it, a process I felt as waves of nausea and cramping that lasted hours. My kidneys received additional filtration structures, thin membranes inserted between existing tissues that immediately began processing the blood flowing through them. The sudden efficiency change creating a noticeable alteration in my body's chemical balance. My heart he left largely untouched, pronouncing it admirably crude but functionally optimal for its crude form. The lungs, however, captured his imagination. Respiratory exchange in Mon-K physiology is grossly inefficient, he said, studying my expanded chest cavity with clear professional interest. You breathe air at approximately 21% oxygen and extract perhaps 4% into your bloodstream. The rest you simply exhale, wasted. I can modify your alveoli to achieve closer to 15% extraction. You will be able to hold your breath for extended periods, operate in low oxygen environments, maintain physical exertion with minimal respiratory stress. What followed was the most intricate procedure he had yet performed. Using instruments so fine they were nearly invisible, he injected a solution directly into my lung tissue that caused the alveoli to begin budding, reproducing themselves and increasing the total surface area available for gas exchange. I felt each new alveolus forming, a tickling sensation deep in my chest that graduated to sharp pain as the expansion strained the pleural cavity. He compensated by carefully expanding the cavity itself, separating my ribs further and introducing a flexible membrane that maintained pressure while allowing greater expansion range. Breathe deeply, he instructed, and I complied involuntarily, my body following his command with the automatic obedience of a well-trained subject. The sensation was remarkable. My lungs filled more completely than they ever had before, the enhanced alveoli extracting oxygen with noticeable efficiency, leaving me feeling almost euphoric from the sudden excess of oxygenated blood reaching my brain. Yes, Cytherean said, satisfaction clear in his voice. You feel it. The improvement, the enhancement. You are becoming something more efficient than standard human. Not better, necessarily, but more refined. Throughout the vivisection, other subjects continued their own transformations around me. The serpentine woman had received the ability to unhinge her jaw like a snake, her mouth now capable of opening to nearly twice the width of her head, the modification allowing her to voice sounds impossible for normal human vocal cords. The orc with crystalline armor had finally died, his regeneration simply unable to keep pace with the continuous crystallization. And his body was being harvested for materials, the Rex carefully extracting organs and tissue samples that would fuel future experiments. The Tau's brain had been completely mapped, and now he hung in stasis while Cytherean decided what to do with the information extracted. The fourth day began with Cytherean announcing that my time with him was coming to an end. You have proven an adequate canvas, he said, almost kindly. Responsive tissue, reasonable pain tolerance, psychological resilience that maintains awareness despite mounting trauma. These are valuable qualities. I had intended to continue your modification for perhaps another month, eventually transforming you into something truly original, but circumstances require I accelerate the final stages. He did not explain what circumstances. I would learn later that Archon Lord Viraxian of the Cabal of the Final Edge had commissioned a raid on the Webway laboratory, intending to steal Cytherean's research into Mon-K modification. The raid would provide accidental salvation for me and the few other subjects still conscious enough to be rescued. But in that moment, I understood only that something was changing in the established routine. We will conclude with synthesis, Cytherean announced, producing a device I had not seen before. It resembled a crown made of metal and organic material fused together, covered in needle-fine probes that glittered in the bioluminescent light. You have been physically modified. Now we address consciousness. The Mon-K mind is trapped in linear thinking, limited by your species' primitive neural architecture. I will expand that architecture. You will experience perception beyond your natural capacity. It will fundamentally alter how you process reality. The crown was placed on my head with ceremonial precision. The probes sank through my skull with surprising ease, each one seeking specific locations in my cerebral cortex and limbic system with the precision of practiced familiarity. I felt them entering my brain tissue, not as pain but as presence, foreign objects occupying space where no objects should exist. Then they activated. Reality fractured. That is the only way I can describe it. My vision split into multiple perspectives simultaneously, seeing myself from the outside while still experiencing my internal viewpoint, perceiving the laboratory from angles that were physically impossible given my position. Time became non-linear, events occurring in multiple sequences at once, past and future bleeding into present moment. I could feel Cythrian's presence in my mind, not as thought but as tangible entity. His consciousness brushing against mine with the curious examination of a scientist probing a specimen. The boundary between self and other became negotiable rather than absolute. You are experiencing multidimensional cognition. Cythrian's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Your consciousness is being temporarily elevated to perceive reality as Eldar do naturally. The effect will fade when I remove the crown, but you will retain memory of this expanded state. And that memory will haunt you. You will always know what consciousness can achieve beyond your species' limitations. He was right. In that state of expanded perception, I understood things that human language cannot adequately convey. I saw the laboratory not as static space, but as trajectory of suffering. Thousands of subjects flowing through its processes in a continuous stream that extended back centuries and forward into indefinite future. I perceived my own body as temporary configuration of matter that could be reconfigured infinitely. My identity not fixed, but rather a pattern that could be rewritten while maintaining continuity of experience. I understood, with terrible clarity, that the Haemonculus were not torturers in any conventional sense. They were artists whose medium was consciousness itself, and suffering was merely the sensation that arose when consciousness was reshaped into forms it had not evolved to accommodate. Then the crown was removed. Reality collapsed back into linear time and singular perspective with a sensation like falling. I gasped, my enhanced lungs drawing deep breath, my modified body feeling suddenly small and limited, and trapped in the three-dimensional space it occupied. Cythrian stood before me, watching my reaction with what might have been sympathy or might have been academic satisfaction. The distinction was meaningless to him. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "What I do here is not cruelty. It is exploration. Every subject teaches me something about the boundaries of flesh and consciousness, and those boundaries are far more flexible than your Imperium believes. You, Mon-K, waste your bodies, treating them as fixed entities rather than potential sculptures. You waste your suffering, experiencing pain without extracting meaning from it. I transform waste into art. I give suffering purpose." He began the process of what he called stabilization, reversing some of the more extreme modifications to ensure my body would not reject the changes once I left his direct supervision. The extra vertebrae were removed, but the elongated spine configuration was maintained through careful restructuring. The facial modifications were locked in place using a chemical treatment that convinced my bones the new shape was their original configuration. The nerve enhancement was reduced from 300% to perhaps 150, enough to maintain heightened sensation without constant overload. The various organ modifications were left intact, though he injected me with suppressants that would manage the transition period. "You will need Medicaid attention once you return to your Imperium," he explained clinically. "The organ modifications require monitoring during the first few months. The bacterial cultures in your digestive tract need periodic culling to prevent overpopulation. The enhanced alveoli require breathing exercises to maintain optimal function. I am providing you with detailed notes on post-modification care. Your Medicae will be horrified, but the information is medically sound. He actually prepared a data slate containing comprehensive medical documentation of every modification performed. The clinical detachment of the gesture, treating me as a patient rather than a victim, ensuring proper aftercare for art he would never see again, was somehow more disturbing than the modifications themselves. He was not a monster. He was a craftsman, ensuring his work remained functional after leaving his workshop. The rescue came during what I later learned was my 104th hour in captivity. Cythrian had returned me to passive suspension, allowing my stabilized modifications to set when the laboratory's entire structure shuddered with the impact of breaching charges. Alarms, organic sirens that screamed with sounds no machine could produce, began wailing throughout the complex. Cythrian moved with sudden urgency, activating stasis fields around his most valuable subjects and securing his instruments with practiced efficiency. Kabbalite raid, he said, more to himself than to me. Predictable. Byraxian has wanted my research for decades. He will be disappointed to find most of my work exists only in my personal memory. He glanced at me, something calculating in his expression. You are functional. You will likely survive rescue if it comes. Remember what you learned here, Captain Kellen. Remember that flesh is merely possibility waiting to be realized. Then he was gone, moving through a concealed doorway that sealed behind him with the finality of a closing tomb. Moments later, Space Marines of the Blood Angels chapter breached the main laboratory entrance, their crimson armor stark against the organic architecture, their weapons seeking targets with trained precision. What they found was a charnel gallery of horrors, hundreds of subjects in various states of modification, most too far gone to save, many pleading for death rather than rescue. I was one of 17 subjects recovered alive from Cythrian's laboratory. 4 others survived long enough to reach Medicae facilities. 2 of those died during initial examination when their modified organs failed under the stress of emergency treatment. The final survivor besides myself chose self-termination 3 weeks after rescue, unable to process the memory of what had been done to him. I am the only one who remains functional. Functional, but fundamentally altered. The comment section here, this is where you tell the Imperium you were here. Type anatomist if you think the price of my survival was too high. Let them know someone bears witness. The Medicae facilities on the Blood Angels strike cruiser were sophisticated by Imperial standards, staffed by apothecaries whose expertise exceeded anything civilian hospitals could offer. They examined me with thorough professionalism, cataloging each modification, debating whether to attempt reversals or allow the changes to remain. The enhanced lungs they left intact, pronouncing them functionally superior to baseline human respiratory system. The organ modifications they monitored carefully but did not attempt to reverse, determining that the changes, while radical, had been performed with such precision that reversal would be more dangerous than acceptance. The skeletal alterations were permanent, irreversible without complete reconstruction that would likely kill me. The data slate Cythrian had provided proved invaluable. His notes were comprehensive, written in flawless High Gothic with the clinical precision of academic medical literature. The apothecaries studied it with fascinated horror, recognizing the sophistication of techniques that exceeded imperial medical knowledge by orders of magnitude. They followed his aftercare instructions exactly, managing the transition period for my modified organs with the same suppressants he had recommended, performing the breathing exercises he had detailed to maintain my enhanced alveolar function. This is work beyond anything we can achieve, one apothecary admitted during my 3rd week of recovery. The modifications are stable, sophisticated, and apparently permanent. You have been enhanced in several significant ways. Your respiratory system now functions at nearly Astartes efficiency. Your digestive tract extracts nutrients with remarkable thoroughness. Your liver processes toxins that would disable a normal human. In purely physical terms, you are improved. And in psychological terms? I asked, my voice still raw from weeks of screaming. He was silent for a long moment. You are irreparably damaged, he said finally. You will never trust your own body again. You will never forget what was done to you. The physical improvements come with a cost measured in sanity and identity. The Haemonculi understand this trade. They value it. They consider psychological trauma to be part of the artwork. He was right. 3 months after rescue, I was judged physically fit for duty, but psychologically unsuitable for frontline command. The nightmares were constant, vivid recreations of being suspended in Scythrian's laboratory, feeling tools that no longer touched me, performing procedures that had already been completed. I developed hypervigilance regarding medical personnel, unable to suppress panic responses during routine examinations. Certain smells, preservatives, certain types of incense, the metallic tang of surgical instruments triggered complete dissociative episodes. The Imperial mind healers tried various interventions: hypnotherapy to suppress traumatic memories, chemical treatments to moderate emotional response, exposure therapy to reduce trigger sensitivity. Nothing worked. The memories were too vivid, too complete, recorded with the enhanced perception Zithrian's crown had temporarily granted me. I could recall every detail of my modification with crystalline clarity, could feel phantom sensations of procedures performed months ago, could hear Scythrian's voice explaining his craft with scholarly enthusiasm. Most disturbing were the moments when I found myself appreciating the modifications. My enhanced lungs allowed me to run longer distances without fatigue, to function in low-oxygen environments that would leave normal humans gasping. My improved digestion meant I could process field rations that would sicken others, extract nutrition from marginal food sources during supply shortages. My restructured face, while strange to my eyes, apparently followed proportions that others found striking, leading to comments about distinguished features from those who had never known my original appearance. I was objectively improved in multiple measurable ways, and that improvement was inseparable from the trauma that had created it. 17 months after rescue, I was reassigned to administrative duties on Terra. The reasoning was transparent. Remove me from situations that might trigger combat stress response. Give me work that could be performed in controlled environments. Allow me to contribute to the Imperium without risking operational collapse during critical moments. I accepted the assignment without protest. Command had been taken from me not by the Dark Eldar, but by the modifications they had left behind. I work now in the Departamento Munitorum Strategic Assessment Division, analyzing threat patterns and resource allocation models. The work is intellectually demanding but emotionally minimal, requiring cognitive function without personal investment. My colleagues know I am combat injured, though the specific nature of my injuries remains classified at my request. Some assume I suffered severe wounds that left permanent mobility limitations, not understanding that my body is actually enhanced rather than damaged. Others assume psychological trauma too severe to discuss, which is accurate but incomplete. What they cannot know, what I have told no one, is that I can still feel Scythrian's tools. Not metaphorically, not as trauma-induced hallucination. I actually feel them. The enhanced nerve sensitivity he induced never fully faded, remaining at approximately 130% baseline instead of returning to standard levels. This means I experience tactile sensation with abnormal clarity, feeling textures and pressures that normal humans barely notice. And sometimes, during stress or exhaustion or for no identifiable reason at all, I feel pressure patterns that match the tools he used, the flensing hooks tracing my forearm muscles, the nerve mapping filaments spread across my chest, the cranial probes entering my skull. The sensations are brief, lasting only seconds, but they are distinct and unmistakable. The Medici cannot explain this. The sensations do not correspond to any nerve damage or psychological condition in their databases. One apothecary theorized that Scythrian's modifications created somatic memory, the nervous system recording not just the fact of trauma, but the specific sensation patterns, which then replay spontaneously as a form of neural persistence. Another suggested that the crown device had created permanent cognitive alterations that allow my brain to spontaneously recall sensations with tactile fidelity. No one knows for certain. No one has sufficient expertise in Haemonculus techniques to provide definitive answers. What I know, what I have learned through 23 months of living with these modifications, is that Cythrian was right about the purpose of suffering. He transformed waste into art. My trauma has meaning, not the meaning the Imperium would assign. Heroic endurance, martyrdom for the Emperor, dutiful sacrifice, but the meaning he intended. I am a demonstration of flesh's malleability, consciousness's flexibility, and the permanent impact that skilled modification can achieve. Every phantom sensation of his tools reminds me of this lesson. Every moment of appreciating my enhanced capabilities confirms it. I am improved, damaged, transformed, and whole simultaneously. I am his artwork walking around in Imperial uniform, continuing to exist as proof that bodies and minds are merely configurations that can be reconfigured. The Imperium has no vocabulary for this understanding. They see me as victim needing recovery or damaged soldier requiring retirement. They cannot conceive that I might be both traumatized and improved, both harmed and enhanced, both violated and refined. The Dark Eldar understand these contradictions instinctively. They build their entire civilization on the recognition that pain and pleasure, damage and improvement, destruction and creation are not opposites, but rather points on a continuum of experience. Cythrian taught me this through direct demonstration, and the lesson remains carved into my flesh and nerves and bones. There are moments, usually late at night when exhaustion has eroded my mental defenses, when I wonder what would have happened if the rescue had not come, if I had remained in Cythrian's laboratory for the full month he had planned. What form would I have taken? How far could the modifications have gone? What would I have become if his vision had reached completion? These thoughts horrify and fascinate me in equal measure. I am grateful for rescue, while simultaneously curious about the road not traveled, the artwork left incomplete. The Craftworld Eldar woman from the laboratory sometimes appears in my dreams. She was one of the subjects left behind, too deeply modified for emergency extraction, her flowering body requiring Cythrian's personal expertise to maintain. I wonder if she still hangs in that crystalline cage, bloomed still cycling through life and death in measured rhythm, each iteration extracting carefully calibrated suffering. I wonder if she has transcended suffering through prolonged exposure, if consciousness can adapt to continuous pain until it becomes normal. I wonder if she, like me, has learned to appreciate the artistry of her own modification. The psychological burden of this speculation is precisely what the Haemonculus understand, and the Imperium does not. It is not the pain itself that breaks subjects. It is the recognition that pain can coexist with improvement, that suffering can produce genuine enhancement, that trauma can be simultaneously destructive and creative. This recognition fractures the moral certainties that allow humans to process experience into categories of good and bad, harm and help, victim and beneficiary. I am all of these simultaneously. I cannot heal because healing would mean returning to a previous state, and that state was objectively inferior in multiple measurable ways. If you have read this far, if you have followed me through these descriptions of what a Haemonculus laboratory truly means, you might understand why I still serve the Imperium despite knowing they cannot comprehend what happened to me. It is not loyalty in the conventional sense. It is recognition that the alternative is worse. Cythrian's laboratory was personal hell customized specifically for me, but it was hell with purpose, suffering with artistic intent. The galaxy contains countless forms of suffering without purpose, pain without meaning, trauma that produces only damage without corresponding enhancement. If I must live with permanent modifications and phantom tools and somatic memories, better to do so in service to something that at least pretends to value human life, than to surrender to the civilization that sees human life as merely raw material for art. This is what the Imperium offers. The illusion that suffering serves a greater purpose. What the Dark Eldar offer is the truth that suffering can serve personal refinement, but ultimately exists for its own sake. Neither answer is comforting. Neither answer makes the phantom sensations stop. Neither answer erases the memory of Cythrian's voice explaining his craft with the enthusiasm of a master discussing his life's work. Neither answer changes the fact that I can still feel the tools. But one answer allows me to pretend there is meaning beyond the individual. One answer provides framework for processing trauma into something approaching purpose. One answer lets me believe that my modifications serve the Emperor rather than merely demonstrating Dark Eldar sophistication. The belief may be delusion, but it is functional delusion, allowing me to maintain service and identity and some approximation of sanity. I sometimes receive reports from the Ordo Xenos about Dark Eldar activity in the Segmentum. Raids on Imperial worlds, slave-taking operations, webway piracy. Each report arrives with clinical detachment, reducing the horror I experienced to tactical data points and threat assessments. I compile these reports into briefings for commanders who will never understand what their soldiers face if captured. I provide recommendations for rapid response protocols designed to minimize survival time should capture occur, suggesting quick death as preferable alternative to what awaits in Comora's laboratories. My suggestions are rarely implemented. The Imperium values recovery of captured personnel, believes that any life can be salvaged, maintains faith that the Emperor protects even those taken by Xenos. The Emperor does not protect. Cythrian taught me that with surgical precision. The Emperor is a distant corpse on a golden throne, his supposed protection merely statistical probability and individual determination. When the Dark Eldar came for Firebase Mordian, no divine intervention stopped them. When I hung in Cythrian's laboratory, no holy presence shielded me from his tools. When my body was systematically modified against my will, no sacred power restored my original form. The protection I eventually received came from space marines wielding practical weapons executing tactical operations. Salvation was mundane, achieved through violence and timing rather than faith and devotion. This recognition, like everything else Cythrian taught me, is something I cannot express within Imperial culture. The official report of my rescue describes how the Emperor's angels delivered me from Xeno's corruption, how faith sustained me through trials, how duty kept me mentally intact during captivity. The report is false but necessary, conforming to acceptable narrative frameworks that allow the Imperium to process my experience without confronting its implications. I signed the report without protest. Truth is luxurious, and I can no longer afford luxury. The final lesson Cythrian taught me, the one I understood only through extended reflection, is that Haemonculus are honest in ways the Imperium can never be. They do not pretend their work serves higher purpose. They do not claim their suffering extraction benefits some greater good. They do not justify their art through reference to external validation. They simply create, modify, explore, and perfect, acknowledging that these activities exist for their own sake and need no external justification. Their honesty is monstrous because it removes the comfortable lies that allow humans to process cruelty as necessary evil rather than chosen practice. The Imperium performs cruelties that rival anything in Comorag's laboratories. Penal legions are death sentences disguised as military service. Servitor conversion is lobotomy and cybernetic enslavement. Exterminatus is planetary murder. But the Imperium wraps these cruelties in theological justification, necessary sacrifice for species survival, duty and honor, and service. The comfortable lies make the cruelties palatable, allow participants to maintain identity as heroic servants rather than complicit instruments of horror. Cythrian removed those comfortable lies and showed me cruelty practiced honestly, without justification beyond artistic satisfaction. The honesty was more disturbing than the cruelty itself. I write this account knowing it will never be published, never enter official records, never become part of the documented knowledge base that might help future victims of Dark Eldar capture. The truths contained here are too destabilizing, too corrosive to the moral frameworks that keep imperial society functional. But I write it anyway, compiling this testimony as personal record of what Haemonculus laboratories actually contain, what they actually do, what they actually mean for subjects who survive them. Subscribe if you believe these testimonies matter, even when they cannot be officially acknowledged. Let your engagement be the record that the Imperium will never maintain. The phantom sensations are strongest when I am alone. During the day, surrounded by colleagues and workflows and administrative demands, my consciousness remains anchored in immediate concerns. My enhanced perception serves practical purposes, allowing me to notice details others miss in strategic documents, to maintain focus during extended analysis sessions, to function with minimal rest due to my improved respiratory efficiency. The modifications integrate into daily function seamlessly, proving themselves genuinely useful rather than merely decorative. But at night, when external stimuli fade and consciousness turns inward, I feel the tools, the flensing hooks mapping muscle fibers with patient precision, the nerve enhancement filaments spreading across sensitized skin, the bone cage pulling skeletal structure into new configurations, the cranial probes entering my skull to expand consciousness beyond normal human parameters. Each sensation is brief, lasting only moments, but intensely vivid, carrying with it associated memories of Cythrian's voice explaining procedures, his hands moving with practiced grace, his eyes studying my reactions with scholarly interest. I have learned to exist with these sensations rather than fighting them. Resistance only amplifies their intensity, creating feedback loops of stress and phantom pain that can last hours. Acceptance allows them to pass quickly, recognized and acknowledged, but not dwelt upon. This is another lesson from the laboratory. Suffering that cannot be prevented can sometimes be accommodated, integrated into normal consciousness, rather than treated as intrusive foreign experience. I am modified. I will remain modified. The sensations are part of my new normal, no more removable than the enhanced lungs or restructured bones. 23 months since rescue, 17 months since reassignment to Terra, approximately 697 nights sleeping with phantom sensations, approximately 697 mornings waking with the knowledge that this is permanent, that my body carries modifications that will persist until death, that I am Cythrian's artwork continuing to exist in the galaxy regardless of his current location or activities. The numbers do not make it easier. They simply provide framework for measuring time that passes without change. I sometimes wonder if other survivors exist, if there are other Imperial citizens walking around with Haemonculus modifications hidden beneath uniforms and civilian clothes. The statistical probability is high. The Dark Eldar have been raiding Imperial space for millennia. Millions have been taken to Komora. Some tiny percentage must survive and return. Where are they? Do they also feel phantom tools? Do they also appreciate their enhanced capabilities while simultaneously carrying trauma? Do they also struggle with the recognition that they are improved and damaged simultaneously? The Imperium does not track such statistics. Post-traumatic rehabilitation focuses on conventional combat stress, sexual assault, physical torture, psychological manipulation. There is no protocol for survived extended modification by Xeno's flesh sculptor and returned with permanent enhancements. The category does not exist in Imperial medical taxonomy. So I suspect other survivors simply integrate their modifications and trauma into private silence, maintaining service while carrying secrets too complex for official processing. This is the final horror of the Haemonculus laboratory. Not the immediate suffering, not the physical modifications, not even the permanent trauma. The final horror is that it continues indefinitely, rippling forward through time, affecting every moment of remaining life, transforming survivors into walking testaments of Dark Eldar sophistication that the Imperium can never acknowledge or address. We carry Komora with us. We are permanent galleries for artwork created in laboratories we escaped but can never leave. We are living demonstrations that flesh is malleable, consciousness is flexible, and horror can produce genuine improvement that makes returning to previous states impossible, even if it were physically feasible. I can still feel the tools. The sensation will never stop. I will carry Cytrian's work until death, and even death might not be released because the modifications extend to cellular level, altering genetic expression in ways that might persist beyond biological termination. I am his artwork in perpetuity, transformed by 4 days in his laboratory into something that can never again be simply human in the baseline sense. And here is the truth that I cannot tell the mind healers, cannot express in official reports, cannot share with colleagues. Part of me is grateful. Part of me recognizes that those 4 days of suffering purchased capabilities that will serve me for decades. Part of me understands that Cytrian gave me something valuable, even as he took something irreplaceable. Part of me knows that the cost was too high, but the purchase was genuine. This gratitude is the ultimate violation, not the physical modifications, not the psychological trauma, not the permanent phantom sensations. The violation is that he made me complicit in my own transformation, made me appreciate the results enough that I cannot simply categorize the experience as pure harm. He fractured my ability to process my own experience into coherent moral categories. He taught me that improvement and damage can be identical, that refinement and violation can be indistinguishable, that art and atrocity can be the same act viewed from different perspectives. The Imperium trains its soldiers to resist interrogation, but not this. Not the recognition that the enemy can be simultaneously monster and craftsman, that suffering can have aesthetic value, that trauma can produce genuine benefit that complicates victimhood beyond simple narratives of heroic endurance. Cytrian knew this when he modified me. He created not just artwork but testimony, walking evidence that his craft achieves genuine transformation rather than merely inflicting damage. I am proof of concept, demonstration model, living advertisement for Haemonculus sophistication. And I continue to serve the Imperium because the alternative is acknowledging that his point was valid, that flesh is merely possibility waiting to be realized, that the distinction between improvement and violation is ultimately subjective rather than objective. I serve because service provides structure that prevents that acknowledgement from becoming conscious acceptance. I serve because the alternative is philosophical horror worse than physical modification. This is what a Haemonculus laboratory is from the inside. It is a place where bodies are revealed to be temporary configurations rather than fixed identities. It is space where consciousness learns its own malleability through direct demonstration. It is gallery where artwork and atrocity become indistinguishable. It is workshop where suffering is refined into meaning through skilled application of impossible techniques. It is nightmare made manifest in polished metal and living architecture. It is horror that continues long after rescue, persistent and inescapable, carried in modified flesh and phantom sensations and fractured understanding of self. And I can still feel the tools. If you made it to the end, if you witnessed this complete testimony of what survival means, let the final word you leave be transformed. Not for me. For everyone who went to the Dark City and came back carrying pieces of Komorag in their flesh and memory. They deserve to be counted, even when the Imperium won't count them.